So next, though, is Brianna Bedran. She is entering her fourth year of political science, specializing in Law and Judicial Studies at McMaster University. Her goal is to attend graduate school at Dalhousie University, studying public policy. Brianna researches many social justice topics, including the representation of women in politics, sexual misconduct, budget cuts, and city planning. Here she is with her presentation, That's Their Choice, Hamilton's Response to People Without Housing During COVID-19. You can take the floor, Brianna.
Hello, everybody. I hope we're doing well. Thank you for the introduction. I realize the description I provided was a little wordy, sorry about that. But today I'll be discussing Hamilton's response, or lack thereof, to people without housing during COVID-19, and I'll go into their planning as well before the pandemic hit. So I'm sure you guys are not as bad with geography as I am, but I will just quickly introduce its location. I'm not sure if any of you guys are from Hamilton, but it's located in Southern Ontario, but it's more so recognized as within the GTA region. I focus on Hamilton for the topic of people without housing, as there are regions such as like Toronto and London that do have higher numbers of people without housing. But I've grown up here. I've done all of my schooling here since elementary, currently attend McMaster here. So though I can never truly understand the perspective of living without housing, the topic does hit pretty close to home. So I'll just start off with what it means to live without housing. Homelessness is a subjective term. It's not restricted to living on the streets or sleeping in places not deemed for habitation. The term includes staying overnight in emergency shelters, temporary living as a hidden person without housing, staying with friends, family, or strangers in hostels or rooming houses, and or residing in precarious housing. So when we talk about people without housing, this can encompass many different situations, and it can also change on a daily basis and happen to any person. As recently released by Statistics Canada, more than 235,000 people in Canada experience housing struggles at any given year, and 25,000 to 35,000 people may be experiencing homelessness at any given night. One may argue, I'm sure one wouldn't, but one may argue that compared to the large population of Canada, this is an insignificant number. But I take the perspective, and I'm sure many of us can agree, that this is still a large proportion of people to live without housing. Also gathered from administrative data, health based on emergency visits to departments, from 2010 to 2017, over 39,000 people were identified as experiencing homelessness. After 2014, the number of patients visiting the emergency department increased until the last year of observation in 2017. So these are just the statistics gathered based on people who have visited the hospital and have reported to have been living without housing. So it's difficult to accurately represent how many people are experiencing homelessness. Not all people reach out for assistance, so the numbers are most likely much higher than what's reported. So let's narrow down our statistics to Hamilton. The reported number of people living without housing in 2018 was 385 people, but this number has increased since the pandemic. However, I could not find any accurate statistics that are more updated than 2018. These numbers are gathered from the Canadian Observatory for Homelessness, which, by the way, the Canadian Observatory is a really great website to turn to if you're looking for resources or just any research or quick facts. And it's also where I've gathered a good amount of my statistics from. So how does Hamilton combat this issue? Let's first go into the 3 ways we can address homelessness. There are 3 ways we can address homelessness according to the Canadian Observatory. The approaches involve 1, prevention, 2, emergency responses, and 3, accommodation. Stopping people from experiencing homelessness in the first place is, of course, a preventative response. Providing support like shelter, food, and day programs while somebody is without housing is the emergency response. And the provision of housing and ongoing support as a means of moving people out of homelessness is accommodation. And unfortunately, Hamilton has lacked on all 3 of these responses. In 2013, Hamilton released their approach to addressing affordable housing and homelessness. In this action plan, they did address the severity of homelessness in Hamilton and their mission to provide affordable housing for low-income families and individuals without housing. However, in effect, the plan was not adequate for the numbers of people experiencing homelessness. So Hamilton does provide social housing, which is great, although it does fall within their responsibilities, so we can't give them too much credit there. And even so, they do provide social housing. The number of housing placements is over 100 people less than the amount of people experiencing homelessness. As we've covered, the amount of people in Hamilton experiencing this is 385 in the year 2018. And in the same year, the number of housing placements was only 254 people. Additionally, the estimated wait time for social housing in Hamilton is nearly 2.5 years. If one finally gets placed in social housing, the average cost for a one-bedroom apartment is $845. If you live in Hamilton, you would know that $845 is lower than the average rent cost. Average rent cost here is probably like $1,500 for a one-bedroom apartment. But the average social assistance amount in Hamilton for an individual is only $733. So the social housing cost compared to the rent doesn't even match up. And I will also add that although this may not be the first viable option anyhow for somebody experiencing homelessness compared to social housing services, Hamilton is now ranked at the third least affordable housing by Oxford Economics. So, Hamilton's resources to combat homelessness are not allocated based on the data and not representative of the amount of people who are experiencing housing issues. The number of placements is less than the number of people experiencing housing issues. The average wait time is way too long, and the contrast of social assistance to social housing rent cost will cause individuals to be barely getting by. This is especially dangerous for women and gender diverse people. Our best estimates of homelessness among women and gender diverse people in Canada is not representative, which is partly due to the hidden nature of their homelessness. Black women, women of color, Indigenous women, gender diverse people, disabled women, poor women, LGBTQ plus individuals, sex workers, incarcerated women, and younger and older women are all disproportionately affected and face the most severe housing needs. It's important to address that women are less likely to appear in mainstream shelters, drop-in spaces, public spaces, and homeless-specific services, and they're more likely to rely on dangerous supports to survive. For time purposes, I won't fully go into how women are disproportionately affected by housing needs, but we are greatly undercounting and failing to respond to the large proportion of women without housing in Canada. Hamilton doesn't have many women's-only shelters, and the prominence and greater visibility of men in the homelessness sector has led to like a male-centric policy and service environment, creating the conditions for women's homelessness to remain invisible and leading them to return to or turn to precarious situations. So we've gone over the severity of housing needs prior to the pandemic and Hamilton's response. How has Hamilton responded during COVID-19? So increase in homeless encampments have been seen around Hamilton last March and April due to the significant rise of people without housing during COVID. And in response, Hamilton task forces dismantled these unsanctioned shelters, claiming a suit to their unsanitary nature for those living them and residents living around them. As suggested by UN lead rapporteurs on the rights to adequate housing, Caitlin Schwan and Eleni Farha, Hamilton's protocol response to encampments neglects the rights and dignities of these residents. And further clarified by international human rights laws, governments are not permitted to destroy people's homes, even if those homes are made of improvised materials and established without legal authority. So not only is the city creating further difficulties during these times of struggles, bylaw officers are breaking laws while revoking the rights of individuals trying to find shelter. Well, according to the mayor of Hamilton, that's their decision. We've covered the scarce resources, limited funding placements, and limited housing placements and funding for such placements. But last summer, Fred Eisenberger informed Global News that there are some people who will not go to shelters and they decide they want to find another way of living. I personally have to disagree with Eisenberg on this one and suggest that the large proportion of people without housing are not deciding that they want to find another way of living. They're left with little to no choice. We do have shelters here in Hamilton, but aside of the lack of protection for women, limited placements, and funding we've covered, let's also look at what staying in these shelters means during COVID. This past winter, concerns were brought up by doctors that outbreaks of COVID-19 shelters at Hamilton were causing more people experiencing homelessness to sleep outside during the winter. CBC News reported in January there were no new admissions to shelters due to ongoing outbreaks, and there was also no switching between shelters permitted. In just that month of January, 3 shelters in Hamilton experienced outbreaks. So, choosing to sleep outside rather than staying overnight in shelters where 40 people are clustered in tight-knit spaces, if those shelters are even open, as many experienced outbreaks, is not making a decision, as Eisenberger suggests, but being left with no choice. We also have to consider how some people experiencing homelessness may not be in their best health, Whether that's due to lack of nutrients, regular sleep, and struggles with depression and stress, they are disproportionately impacted by COVID. So I started my research for this in April, and since then, Hamilton has changed their approach to encampments, but it was in no way an improvement. Hamilton's encampment response protocol proposed just this month that people camping in public spaces are limited to a maximum of 14 days in one location, and on the 14th day, they will begin tearing down the encampment. So acting so similar to an eviction notice. This also means that somebody just arriving to an encampment can be kicked out just hours later, which actually happened to some individuals. And no other city is using a 14-day timeline around encampments, and it's not clarified why Hamilton came to this response. So these encampments aren't just for individuals, it's for the shelters, outside shelters as a whole. So if somebody had just arrived that day, they still have to leave on the 14th day. So overall, Hamilton's preventive action for homelessness and its response and accommodation has been more than unsatisfactory. There was not much preventative action taken despite their inadequate housing placements with limited funding. And in accordance with their action plan and Hamilton's emergency response and accommodation response of a 14-day eviction notice and the ever so empathetic sentiment of that's their decision demonstrates a lack of accountability for people without housing. That's it for me. My future projections for this project will look more into the specific demographics of people without housing, as well as more insight into Hamilton's budgeting programs and housing needs. Additionally, I think my research will benefit by actually suggesting what I believe an appropriate response to the housing crisis would be. I would also like to conduct my own field research and interviews from organizations around Hamilton that address homelessness while helping out myself. It's important to me that while writing about this topic, I'm also doing my part in helping the community rather than simply just writing about their struggles. Thank you all for listening. I hope this provided some insight on the situation here.
Thank you. That was quite insightful and much needed, I think. So thank you very much, Brianna. We can open the floor to questions now. Okay. Brianna, there's kind of a two-part question. A couple people were wondering what you would propose that Hamilton does or acts as a solution to some of the issues that you've brought up. And Zach had asked, in comparison to Hamilton, have you witnessed any other Canadian cities, that respond better to housing needs? So yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
For sure. So for the first one, that's what I'm looking into next. Difficult to kind of say what I believe would be a better response to that. As I was writing that, I was like, this is what I'm lacking on to actually provide what I think would be. But looking into a lot of organizations in Hamilton, because we do have one, and it's a resource for people who do currently have encampments. It's a new organization. It's kind of a rise during the pandemic. For short-term responses, I think it would be better if bylaw officers actually worked with these organizations. They provide people food, water that are at these shelters, rather than just going in, providing what is basically an eviction notice to these people and then simply leaving. So I think working with organizations would be a better response for Hamilton to do. I think it would also work in their favor for people to perceive them as being much more empathetic to the situation. And tearing down the encampments is just, to me, like a huge no, unless you're going to move those people into housing immediately. Tearing down the encampments, to me, is just a terrible response. So also increase in housing placements. Like I said, there's more people experiencing homelessness than we have housing available. And Hamilton's pretty vast. They can definitely increase the housing options for individuals. And as for the second question, other cities in Hamilton do have other cities in Hamilton, like Toronto has much more encampments, but they're not provided a 14-day eviction notice. So I think that is a better response, even though it still is very sad to see people having to live in the encampments. Nonetheless, I guess it's difficult to say no response is a better response, but at least Toronto didn't provide them with an eviction notice. It's only Hamilton that's done that, and they never really clarified why. But as far as I know, I haven't witnessed any other cities that have provided a really good approach other than simply ignoring the issue.
Right. That is definitely response that we see all too often, unfortunately. So it's voices like yours that we need to bring that to awareness, right? I had one other question as well. I don't know if that you've dipped into this portion of research yet, but I'm wondering if you've noticed any community um, outreach programs happening, or like volunteer run programs that are helping some of these issues. Like in Edmonton, we've got programs like Find Yag and Habitat for Housing, where it's for the accommodation portion of it, at least they're, trying to house as many people as possible at reasonable prices. They work off donation a lot of the time. All of their profits go to housing homeless or people without housing. So have you been seeing community outreach like that in Hamilton?
Yeah, for sure. This is the Hamilton Encampment Support Network. That's a more recent one that I've discovered, and I believe that they were founded pretty shortly after the pandemic arise and the encampment started to arise. And they're a really good resource for people without housing that I've seen a lot over social media. They have their own website. I'll put the link to that as well. I just figured out how to access the chat. So that, as well as the Canadian Observatory, which isn't Hamilton based, but they do provide information on Hamilton and resources for that. They provide resources for every city, actually, so it's really great. So in Hamilton, so far, there's only one that I know of that's community based. But Hamilton does have programs for people without housing. Like I will give them credit there. Like they did establish their plan. They have programs, but the programs aren't very helpful. They're kind of just there, and not a lot of people really turn to them.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think the resources in the resources text channel there will be really good for people to have. And then there is just one more question for you, Brianna. Colton, did you want to speak to it, or do you want me to just read it out?
Yeah, I can speak to it because I think I rewrote that question like 4 or 5 times. I definitely did not want to sound uh, accusational or anything, but I'm definitely curious as to, is there a correlation between these higher risk groups seeking out, unfortunately, these dangerous options for support? Is it because it is in these shelters? Are they predominantly male, and these groups don't feel safe or comfortable, or is there another problem to address?
I think it's definitely because of the prominence of men in the shelters. It makes a lot of women feel unsafe, and Hamilton only has a couple of women-only shelters. It's a very male-centric service for people without housing, for sure. So, and women are already trying to escape these dangerous situations. So, you go to a shelter and you see something that you've just kind of been running from. It turns them to turn away from the shelters and try and find other means, which end up being just as dangerous. So yeah, you definitely got it. I think it's for sure the prominence of men, if not other problems as well, but a big issue is the prominence of men in these shelters.
Thank you.